"So, is anyone coming?" I remember thinking that exact sentence while standing at a small cafe counter in Europe, receipt already printed, card already charged, drink already made, and yet somehow the transaction felt unfinished. In America, this is the moment someone smiles, checks in, asks if everything's okay, maybe even apologizes for nothing. Here, nothing happened. The barista wiped the counter. Another customer walked in. Time stretched. I stood there wondering if I was invisible, or worse, if I had done something wrong. Maybe I'd ordered incorrectly. Maybe my accent had annoyed them. Maybe this was one of those unspoken rules I'd missed. I waited for eye contact like it was a lifeline. None came. The silence wasn't aggressive, but it wasn't friendly either. It just existed, calm and unmoved, like I wasn't part of it. My brain started filling the gap immediately. Should I say something? Would that be rude? In the U.S., silence after payment feels like a problem that needs solving. Someone forgot something. Someone needs reassurance. Someone needs to ask a question. But here, the lack of response felt deliberate, almost confident. The unsettling part wasn't that no one helped me. It was that no one seemed to think I needed help at all. And standing there, drink in hand, heart beating slightly faster than necessary, I realized this wasn't bad service. It was a completely different language, and I didn't speak it yet. That realization lingered longer than the coffee ever did that morning. Section 2, setting the scene, context. 2 definitions of good service. What unsettled me wasn't the coffee or the silence itself, but how quickly my instincts labeled it as wrong. That reaction comes from somewhere specific. In the United States, customer service is emotional labor. Smiles are part of the product. Reassurance is built into the price. Someone checking in isn't just polite, it's proof that you matter, that you're being taken care of, that nothing has gone off script. From a young age, Americans learn that attention equals care. Silence means neglect. In much of Europe, the equation runs in the opposite direction. Distance is respect. Leaving you alone signals trust, not indifference. The server isn't ignoring you. They're assuming you're capable, comfortable, and uninterested in being interrupted every 5 minutes. Neither approach is cruel or superior. They're rooted in different histories, economies, and ideas about dignity. American service culture grew alongside tipping, performance, and the idea that friendliness should be visible. European service culture leans toward professionalism and restraint, where doing the job well means not inserting yourself unnecessarily. The clash happens because both sides interpret the same behavior through opposite emotional lenses. An American sees silence and feels abandoned. A European sees space and feels considerate. Each side believes they're being polite. That's what makes the misunderstanding so persistent and so personal. When expectations collide, it doesn't feel like a cultural difference. It feels like someone failed you. And once that feeling takes hold, every quiet moment starts to feel louder, heavier, and harder to ignore. That tension sits beneath the surface, shaping reactions before logic arrives, turning neutral interactions into emotional experiences, and explaining why something as small as a silent cafe counter can feel surprisingly intimate, confusing, and deeply memorable to visiting Americans abroad. What unsettled me wasn't the coffee or the silence itself, but how quickly my instincts labeled it as wrong. That reaction comes from somewhere specific. In the United States, customer service is emotional labor. Smiles are part of the product. Reassurance is built into the price. Someone checking in isn't just polite, it's proof that you matter, that you're being taken care of, that nothing has gone off script. From a young age, Americans learn that attention equals care. Silence means neglect. In much of Europe, the equation runs in the opposite direction. Distance is respect. Leaving you alone signals trust, not indifference. The server isn't ignoring you. They're assuming you're capable, comfortable, and uninterested in being interrupted every 5 minutes. Neither approach is cruel or superior. They're rooted in different histories, economies, and ideas about dignity. American service culture grew alongside tipping, performance, and the idea that friendliness should be visible. European service culture leans toward professionalism and restraint, where doing the job well means not inserting yourself unnecessarily. The clash happens because both sides interpret the same behavior through opposite emotional lenses. An American sees silence and feels abandoned. A European sees space and feels considerate. Each side believes they're being polite. That's what makes the misunderstanding so persistent and so personal. When expectations collide, it doesn't feel like a cultural difference. It feels like someone failed you. And once that feeling takes hold, every quiet moment starts to feel louder, heavier, and harder to ignore. That tension sits beneath the surface, shaping reactions before logic arrives, turning neutral interactions into emotional experiences, and explaining why something as small as a silent cafe counter can feel surprisingly intimate, confusing, and deeply memorable to visiting Americans abroad. The first night it really hit me was at a small restaurant that looked like it had been there longer than I'd been alive. I sat down, ordered politely, and everything went smoothly at first. The server nodded, wrote nothing down, and disappeared. Minutes later, the food arrived, perfect, and exactly what I'd asked for. Then the room settled. Conversations hummed, cutlery clinked, and my table entered what felt like a social void. In America, this is the point where someone checks in within 60 seconds. How's everything tasting? Can I get you anything else? Here, no one came. 5 minutes passed. 10. I rehearsed polite eye contact, then bolder eye contact, then the subtle half-smile Americans deploy when we want attention without causing trouble. Nothing worked. I started wondering if I was supposed to do something differently. Was I meant to flag someone down? Was that rude? I watched locals sit calmly, eating, talking, unbothered by the absence of supervision. My water glass emptied and stayed empty. In the U.S., an empty glass is an emergency. I felt strangely anxious, like I was failing a test I didn't know I'd signed up for. My inner monologue grew dramatic. Maybe they hated tourists, maybe I'd mispronounced something, maybe I was invisible. Eventually, I leaned toward the aisle and softly said, "Excuse me," bracing for irritation. The server looked genuinely surprised, not annoyed, just confused, as if I'd interrupted something unnecessary. When I asked for water, they nodded and brought it immediately. No apology, no explanation, no warmth, but also no hostility, just efficiency. Sitting there afterward, I realized the restaurant hadn't forgotten me at all. They'd assumed I was fine. In their world, constant check-ins would have felt intrusive, even disrespectful. The discomfort wasn't about service quality. It was about losing the familiar signals that told me I was being cared for. Once those signals disappeared, my brain filled the silence with doubt, turning neutrality into neglect without any evidence to support it. This quiet gap between expectation and reality became the true story. A lesson learned not through lectures, but through waiting, watching, and slowly understanding that discomfort often arrives before insight, especially when familiar rules vanish without warning and no one explains the rules because they assume you already know them or will learn eventually anyway. The next misunderstanding unfolded in a shop where I needed help, but didn't yet know how to ask for it properly. In the U.S., you don't really ask. You wait to be asked. A smile appears, a voice floats over, and the script begins. Here, I stood between shelves, holding an item, hovering in a state of polite paralysis. I cleared my throat softly, then louder, then offered a hesitant, "Excuse me," the way Americans do when we already feel guilty for existing. The employee looked up, paused, and simply said yes, as if waiting for the actual request. I rushed my words, apologizing twice before explaining what I needed, expecting irritation. Instead, I was met with calm efficiency, no visible emotion at all. What struck me wasn't rudeness, but the absence of cushioning. No reassurance that my question was reasonable, no verbal padding to soften the interaction, just information. I walked away unsettled, replaying the exchange, wondering if I'd broken an invisible rule. Later, I noticed locals calling staff with directness that would sound abrupt back home. No apology, no smile, just the request itself. And staff responded the same way, without offense, without warmth, without drama. That's when it clicked that Americans often confuse friendliness with kindness. We apologize to make others comfortable, even when we've done nothing wrong. Europeans, in many places, skip that step entirely. They assume requests are neutral and don't require emotional negotiation. The awkwardness comes from Americans layering feelings onto interactions that aren't designed to carry them. Each sorry becomes unnecessary noise, each pause an invitation for confusion. The silence after a question isn't passive aggression, it's simply waiting. Once I stopped performing politeness and started being clear, the interactions smoothed out instantly. Nothing magical changed except my expectations. I wasn't bothering anyone. I was just speaking a different social dialect. And until I adjusted, every quiet response felt heavier than it needed to be, teaching me that clarity can feel cold only if you're used to warmth being spelled out loud every single time. That realization followed me into cafes, trains, and hotels, where I slowly noticed how much emotional energy Americans expect from strangers, and how liberating it can feel when service is stripped of performance, leaving only function, boundaries, and an unspoken trust that adults will speak up when something is actually needed, rather than assuming reassurance should arrive automatically. A few days later, the same confusion followed me into a clothing store, the kind with minimalist shelves and an almost aggressive amount of calm. I stepped inside prepared for the American routine: greeting, offer of help, gentle pressure, escape plan. None of it came. No hello, no nod. The employee stood behind the counter, not hiding, not watching, simply existing. At first it felt icy. I wandered between racks wondering if I'd been missed, then wondered if I was supposed to announce myself. In the U.S., retail silence feels like neglect or suspicion. Here, it felt intentional. I picked up a jacket and waited for commentary that never arrived. No great choice, no suggestion, no reminder of a sale ending soon. The absence of persuasion was unsettling. Without a script to follow, I became overly aware of my own movements, folding and unfolding the jacket like I was on display. Eventually, I realized something strange was happening. I was relaxing. No one was hovering. No one was emotionally invested in whether I bought anything. For the first time, shopping felt oddly private. When I finally approached the counter with my choice, the employee rang it up without ceremony. No bag upsell, no loyalty pitch, no performative smile, just a total and a nod. Walking out, I felt lighter, but also slightly cheated, like I'd skipped a familiar ritual. In America, retail workers are trained to sell friendliness alongside products, to guide decisions and reduce uncertainty. In much of Europe, the assumption is reversed. You came because you know what you want, or you'll ask if you don't. The freedom is subtle, but powerful. The discomfort Americans feel comes from losing validation, not service. We're used to being affirmed mid-decision, reassured that we're choosing correctly. Without that feedback, doubt rushes in. But standing there on the street, jacket in hand, I realized no one had influenced my choice except me. The silence hadn't pushed me away. It had given me space. And that space, once the initial panic faded, felt surprisingly respectful. It also explained why so many Americans mistake this quiet for coldness, when it's actually a refusal to interfere, a belief that autonomy is more polite than persuasion, and that adults don't need emotional supervision to make ordinary choices, even if that silence initially feels like abandonment rather than trust to visitors encountering it for the first time. The moment it finally clicked didn't come during another awkward interaction, but during a conversation afterward, when I casually mentioned to a local friend that service felt strangely distant. They looked genuinely confused, the way someone does when you complain about gravity. They asked what I meant, so I explained the silence, the lack of check-ins, the feeling of being left alone. They listened patiently, then said something that reframed everything. If you're eating or shopping, why would someone interrupt you? That question landed harder than any culture shock moment before it. In my head, interruption meant care. Here, interruption meant distraction. Suddenly, every quiet interaction replayed itself with new context. The server wasn't forgetting me. They were trusting me to enjoy my meal. The shop assistant wasn't indifferent. They were respecting my space. What I'd read as emotional distance was actually professional restraint. In America, service workers are trained to anticipate needs before they're voiced, to smooth uncertainty before it appears. In Europe, the assumption is that adults will speak up when something's wrong. That shift sounds small, but emotionally it's massive. It means responsibility moves from the worker to the customer. You're not being managed, you're being trusted. That realization explained the calm confidence behind the silence. No one was monitoring my satisfaction, because dissatisfaction wasn't expected unless stated. It also explained why apologies felt unnecessary and smiles optional. Warmth isn't withheld, it's reserved for moments that require it. Once I understood that, the tension drained out of interactions. Silence stopped feeling like rejection and started feeling neutral. The anxiety had never come from how I was treated, but from the absence of familiar signals telling me how to feel. Without those cues, my brain filled the gap with insecurity. That's the dangerous part of cultural habits. They don't feel like habits, they feel like truth. And when that truth disappears, even briefly, it triggers confusion, self-doubt, and the instinct to assign blame. But nothing had gone wrong. The system was working exactly as intended. I just wasn't the intended audience yet. Once that clicked, everything softened. The pauses made sense. The distance felt intentional, and the silence that once made my chest tighten became something closer to relief, like being released from a performance I hadn't realized I was constantly giving, where reassurance wasn't owed and attention wasn't currency, but something exchanged only when genuinely needed. By the time I left, I stopped seeing these moments as good service versus bad service and started seeing them as different emotional contracts. Americans grow up learning that friendliness is proof of care, that attention means safety, that someone checking in is a small promise you haven't been forgotten. It's comforting, especially in a country built on mobility, strangers, and constant motion. Europe, in many places, operates on a quieter trust. If nothing is wrong, no one intervenes. If you need something, you say so. Neither approach is colder or kinder, just tuned to different fears. Americans fear neglect. Europeans fear intrusion. That difference shapes everything from restaurants to retail to how silence itself is interpreted. Once I understood that, the frustration dissolved into curiosity. I stopped waiting for reassurance and started noticing how much freedom came with being left alone. Meals felt longer, shopping felt calmer, conversations felt more intentional. At the same time, I recognized why Americans struggle with this shift. Silence can feel personal when you're used to constant affirmation. It can trigger the feeling that you've done something wrong when you haven't. That discomfort isn't weakness, it's conditioning. Cultural habits wire emotional expectations so deeply that breaking them feels like rejection. The real takeaway isn't that one culture should change to suit the other, but that misunderstanding thrives when we assume our norms are universal. Once you recognize the invisible rules shaping your reactions, those moments lose their sting. Silence stops sounding like disapproval entirely. Sometimes the hardest part of traveling isn't the language, the food, or the logistics, but realizing that what once felt like basic kindness is actually cultural choreography. If you've ever stood in a cafe, a shop, or a restaurant abroad wondering whether you were being ignored, you weren't alone, and you probably weren't wrong either. You were just reading the moment through a different rule book. So I'm curious, which version of service feels more comfortable to you? Do you prefer being checked on, reassured, and guided, or being left alone until you decide otherwise? Share the moment that confused you most, because chances are someone else is still standing in that silence, wondering what it means. These stories connect us precisely because they're small, ordinary, and emotionally honest. If this felt familiar, there are many more moments like it hiding in plain sight, where misunderstanding isn't dramatic, but quietly powerful. The next time you feel that pause, that lack of reaction, that calm neutrality, try seeing it not as absence, but as trust. And if you want more stories about the subtle moments that catch us off guard when cultures collide, stay here.